As we go marching, marching in the beauty of the day, a million darkened kitchens, 1,000 millocks gray, are touched with all the radiance that a sudden sun discloses. For the people hear us singing, bread and roses, bread and roses.
Situated in the North Atlantic, at the most eastern point in North America, lies the great island of Newfoundland. England's first colony in the New World, Newfoundland's vast cod fishery fed the British Empire and trained its navy from the 1500s. But settlement was discouraged in this rugged and bountiful place. Chimneys and women were forbidden. Both flourished. Life was unforgiving in the North Atlantic. Women did hard work alongside men to survive and to build the country. And by the 1850s, the country of Newfoundland was a self-governing dominion in the British Empire. But social conditions were often desperate. Rum was cheap and public drunkenness common. In the capital city of St. John's alone, there was a public liquor house for every 66 men, women, and children. Men and boys were often paid in alcohol in exchange for work. As a result, countless families were living in dire poverty. By the end of the century, conditions had not improved greatly. Epidemics were common. Child mortality was high. It was women who voluntarily did almost all the social work with the starving, the orphans, the widows, and they wanted change in the liquor laws. Women believed if they could vote, they would reform lax liquor laws and put an end to public drunkenness and wife and child abuse. In 1890, they established the Women's Christian Temperance Union in Newfoundland. Members of the WCTU, like young Maria Williams, were among the first women to speak before a mixed audience.
It is a well-known fact that women are the greatest sufferers by strong drink. And if there is any enjoyment in it, it is the men who have it, because they are enjoying the warmth and comfort of the gilded saloon. The poor woman is often found freezing over the fireless stove, or listening to the cries of her poor, hungry, cold, ragged children, and not knowing the moment she will receive the blow from the wretch she is forced to call husband.
In 1891, during a period of particular economic and social unrest in Newfoundland, members of the Women's Christian Temperance Union marched to the House of Assembly in St. John's, demanding the right to vote in local liquor laws. The fashionable Lady Jeanette Thorburn was their patron and led the march. With her was the fiercely outspoken Jessie Murray Oman and the future WCTU president, Emma Peters. These women were among the first feminist voices in Newfoundland. Jessie stated their case.
Women with years of toil in the field of reform have learned that a power we have not is needed to put in practical operation the principles we believe in. That power is the vote.
In her book, Where Once Our Mothers Stood, We Stand, historian Margot Dooley writes that few who marched that day in 1891 would live to see their dream of women's suffrage fulfilled. It would take 34 years for this outrageous notion to become politically acceptable. Arrayed against the new suffragists were the established forces of government, church, and often family. James Murray, Jessie's brother, sat in the House of Assembly and publicly attacked suffrage.
Our current political order is not a human arrangement. but founded on divine appointment, which made the man the federal head of the family. Therefore, to enfranchise the woman is to disenfranchise the man.
Jesse publicly denounced his position and wrote,
"The best appreciated part of Mr. Murray's speech is when he sits down."
James was eventually won over to Jesse's point of view. However, the local press, like the editor of the Telegram, Alexander Parsons, would be harder to persuade.
We have no words of sympathy or encouragement for those ladies who would voluntarily unsex themselves and plunge into the troubled waters of party politics. We say with all reverence and humility, from the terror of such strong-minded lady agitators, good Lord, deliver us.
Jesse's solution was to found the first feminist newspaper in the country of Newfoundland. Sponsored by the WCTU, Water Lily was a paper by and for women. It challenged the conventional press of the day with articles on temperance, sanitation, the demands of married life, and cartoons. He clasped her tiny hand in his and vowed he would shield her from the cold storms of this world. Her beautiful blue eyes met his as she answered, "Thank you, sir. An umbrella will do just as well." It was in Water Lily that Jesse laid out the official suffrage position.
Until woman is politically the equal of man, she cannot be said to have gained that position which her intellectual and moral power warrants her to occupy. Whilst our legislators have granted the franchise to any man of 21 years of age, be he a drunkard, a knave, or a fool, they have deemed women unworthy of the vote. We strive for freedom, for ourselves and all Newfoundland women.
Jessie penned that for her brother and his cronies in the government. But if you were to walk down Water Street, you might hear this little ditty she wrote.
Manhood suffrage for the clown and fool and knave and dandy. But let us keep the women down and gulp our gin and brandy.
All this set the stage for the first House of Assembly debate on women's suffrage in 1893.
The Honourable Mr. Murphy.
It is only the artificial civilization of modern day that allows woman to unsex herself and come down from the pedestal on which man has placed her. Why not give those ladies who want the right of the franchise the ceiling gaff and the toll roll, that they might go to the ice and thus have more right to be considered the equal of man? No! We would never be in favor of unsexing women.
The Honourable Sir James Winton.
It seems the Liberal Party is a backward party. Now, how can it be said that a woman is not fit to record her vote in favor of the establishment of a public house or the erection of a town pump, when a woman is now occupying the highest position in the land by wearing the crown of England?
Honourable the Prime Minister.
Gentlemen, we have debated the issue of women voting in this House of Assembly and have concluded that if women voted in local liquor laws and men's alcohol consumption were restricted, they might get confused and start using opium. Indeed, I would have endorsed the right of women to vote on local option had it not been for the extreme position expressed in this paper they call Water Lily. I call it the dandelion flower.
Water Lily dubbed Sir William the deadly nightshade. But the vote had been cast, 17 opposed, 14 in favor of suffrage. Not one Catholic member voted for suffrage. Sir William had succeeded in characterizing the women as emotional and radical. Even the Methodist temperance supporters backed away from suffrage. At the next great temperance rally in 1894, women attended, but were not allowed to speak. And suffrage was not even on the agenda. The biggest blow to the cause came when Jessie left Newfoundland with husband Niels Oman for Montreal. This marked the end of the first wave of the women's suffrage movement in Newfoundland. At the height of the WCTU campaign, The entire city of St. John's was virtually destroyed by the Great Fire of 1892. Women worked tirelessly over the next decade to raise the funds to rebuild the devastated infrastructure. But they had no say in how the money was spent. This inequity would further motivate the next wave of suffragists. At the age of 21, Armine Nutting came to St. John's alone from Waterloo, Quebec, to become principal of the Church of England Girls' School in St. John's. Armine had left a drunkard father in Quebec. Although people in St. John's society did not realize it, Armine's background was hard times. At her boarding house on Prescott Street, Armine met and married another newcomer to the island, Gilbert Gosling, who would later become mayor of St. John's. Gilbert supported Armine's suffrage work, and the two were a great force in St. John's society. Armine Gosling and the woman she would soon meet, Fanny McNeil, would lead the second wave of the suffrage movement. The Newfoundland Suffragists were a spirited group of artists, writers, musicians, and labor organizers from the educated elite, determined to use their privileged position to improve social conditions and open public life to women. They were involved in all aspects of St. John's life. They formed the first women's curling club, a hockey team, the Girl Guides, and were champion golfers. They also established an all-women's orchestra and a fine arts club. They staged bazaars and elaborate theatricals to raise money for the poor. But most of their lives were filled with relief work. In the early 1900s, whether you were rich or poor, disease knew no class boundaries. Both Armine Gosling and Fanny McNeil were struck with infant death in their own families. Personal misfortune and intimate involvement through relief work contributed to the politicizing of these women. In these respects, the Newfoundland suffragists were much the same class as their suffrage sisters, Carrie Chapman Catt in the United States and the Pankhursts in Britain. However, unlike the movement in major urban centers, women in Newfoundland would have to get the support of people in hundreds of far-flung outports along the 6,000 miles of rugged coast that was rural Newfoundland. By 1910, men's debating clubs had grown to become great social events in St. John's. The Academia Club and the Methodist College Literary Institute were two of the more popular clubs. They held regular debates on important issues, and the results were reported in the papers for those who could not attend. The debates offered a lively discussion of heated topics of the day and were well attended. Women were welcome, but not allowed to speak. At one particular debate in 1910, however, an event occurred that changed women's lives forever.
Mrs. Gosling, Mrs. Gosling, thank you for bringing these British newspapers. What a different story than we read in our local news. Why do we not hear more of the Pankhurst ideas and the great suffrage protests? All we read in the telegram is of shrieking English Amazons.
My dear Mrs. McNeil, we too are going to have to make the news and write it if our views are going to win out.
Surely we will not have to become this extreme before the government sees the justice of our cause.
We may well blame the militant suffragettes for violence, but there is not the slightest doubt that thousands of people in England and elsewhere who have not even considered the question are now considering it very carefully, and only because these women are deliberately facing prison for their convictions.
Still, I cannot see chaining myself to the House of Assembly on Military Road. We know all these men here in government personally. I hope that political lobbying and logic will move them to give us the vote.
You tell me, Mrs. McNeil, is there anything logical about having a debate on woman suffrage here in this men's club tonight? Imagine, we're not even permitted to speak on our own behalf.
Society all over the world is changing, and even here in St. John's. It is fitting that women should keep up with the pace of the times and take their seat beside men in the public arena. But it would be folly for women to get upset over their exclusion from public affairs. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Shea.
Have I missed much, Mrs. McNeil? Nothing of any intelligence, Miss Kennedy.
Mr. Shea is far too placid.
Oh, such talk, we could barely restrain ourselves.
Perhaps Mr. Kinsella will be more insightful.
Why should women unsex themselves for a task that has always been the work of their fathers and sons? If women were to leave the home to take up such manly duties, then surely chaos would ensue. If I have learned anything in all my years as a columnist with the Daily News, it is how vital it is to know one's place in society. And surely women's place is in the home, where she can reign like a queen. To give women the right to vote is to place something of great importance in the hands of illiterate people, and that would be foolhardy.
In the name of Emmeline Pankhurst in Great Britain and Carrie Chapman Catt of the United States, I cannot stand idly by and listen to these petty arguments. I regret, sirs, that women are not permitted to debate publicly. But if we could, we should surely raise far more intelligent arguments as to why women should have the vote than those raised by men here tonight as to why women should not be granted this privilege.
I regret, madam, that I will have to ask you to leave the premises.
Women are taxed in 1,000 ways, and yet you men do not see fit to let us have a say in the laws that govern taxation.
And I beg you to do so without the fanfare of the Pankhursts.
Well said, Mr. Dudley. Go home, make your bread.
Furthermore, women will be forever barred from this establishment.
This was the beginning of a new era for women. In the old Lion building on Water Street, an ideal drop-in location, they established their own women's club, the Ladies' Reading Room. Unlike the involvement of the temperance movement in women's suffrage, the Ladies' Reading Room was non-denominational. This proved to be its greatest strength because women put aside the politics of religion and were free to focus on the real task of winning the vote. 20 years earlier, Jessie Murray Oman's speech was heard as the creed of the first wave of the suffrage movement. Now, Armine Gosling's speech would stake out the position for the second wave.
Our political standing is much as it was 100 years ago. We are still classified, for purposes of legislation, with idiots, criminals, paupers, and minors. And even in that dubious company hold an inferior place. A male idiot may regain his reason. A male criminal may reform. A pauper may acquire land. A minor will grow up. And in each case will be eligible to vote. But women, being women, remain voteless. Legal and political non-entities to the end. The vote is the hallmark of citizenship, and the exclusion of women from it means the exclusion of women from the serious life of this age. But the final struggle must come soon. Sympathizers all over the world are watching. They know that when England adopts equal suffrage, then the women of every country shall profit by it. We will not stop until that victory is also ours.
Agnes, isn't your mother back from Colorado?
Yes, she arrived on a steamer today, but she's exhausted from traveling. So she asked me to hand out these pamphlets from the Colorado Women's Club. Seems the vote for women is all the talk in America.
Good day, Mrs. Earle.
Mrs. McNeil.
Wasn't Mrs. Gosling's speech food for our souls?
Well, I'm always interested in Mrs. Gosling's interpretation of what winning suffrage will mean. Oh, now you know I support the cause, Mrs. McNeil. But for the last 3 club days, enfranchisement has been the topic of discussion. Women of influence are turning a blind eye to the real social welfare needs of the common people.
As I see it, Mrs. Earle, women are making great progress in alleviating many social problems. I admire your work to improve the conditions of factory workers. But the work of the ladies' reading room is essential to unite the women from all around the coast of Newfoundland. Women you and I may never know beyond a signature on the petitions.
I totally agree. I totally agree with the need to unite and educate women. But, Mrs. McNeil, I cannot stand alongside those who refuse to see the real need for change. In child labor, oh, there are those who toil so hard. Some of them as young as 10 and 11 years old, on their feet from 7 in the morning till 7 at night. And for a wage that in every case gives little more than bread and tea.
Mrs. Earle, sorry to trouble you, ma'am, but they told me I could fetch you here. There's been an accident at the rope walk factory and my ma'am's hand got stuck in one of the machines. Mrs. Riley asked if you could come.
Please excuse me, ladies.
Oh, surely you're not going to the factory yourself, Mrs. Earle.
Indeed I am. Who else is going to talk to the board of directors? I suggest the entire reading circle take a walk through the rope walk factories and see what your gentlemen friends, Mr. Walter Monroe and Sir Edgar Bowring, are up to. Mrs. Browning might also be interested in her husband's bakery. These factories oppress the very women you're trying to liberate.
To be fair to Mrs. Browning, she has been the backbone of many charities in St. John's. Let us not be divided over this.
Such activities are bandages, Mrs. McNeil. Mere bandages.
Only a factory girl, and she works in a mill, and her hands are deft and her hands are strong, and she works and she toils the whole day long, and she works with a right good will.
Women's hope for recognition and a better day came disguised as war and calamity. Suffrage was put on the back burner during the Great War. The Newfoundland Suffragists, like many in England and America, urged their followers to throw themselves wholeheartedly into the war effort. Under the banner of the Women's Patriotic Association, women throughout the Empire offered distaff, or women's services, to supply and support the troops. Within days, the distaff movement spread to the coastal outports, with 208 branches between Battle Harbour, Labrador, and Burgeo on the southwest coast. The job of coordinating this army of service fell to the secretary of the WPA, Armine Gosling. The WPA galvanized and educated women through a second women's newspaper, the Distaff, which reprinted articles sent from the British Women's Suffrage Union. The Distaff kept count of contributions from around the country. Socks, which the British Empire were in short supply of, were a priority. In the trenches, a soldier could lose his feet for want of a proper pair of socks, and the Newfoundland Regiment had suffered severe frostbite in Gallipoli. So socks could be found on tables or in work baskets in every home. They were the bond of unity between rich and poor. On April 16, 1916, Private Frank Mayo Lind wrote a report to the Daily News from his station in France.
The Newfoundland sock is the best in the world, and it is prized by every soldier. How many times at the peninsula, and before we ever saw Egypt or France, have we been asked by soldiers of different regiments if we had a pair of Newfoundland socks to give them or sell them? You can just imagine the feeling of our fellows when dished out socks made by the WPA back home.
2 months later, Private Lind would walk and write no more. By 1916, war casualties mounted. The small dominion of Newfoundland suffered one of the highest casualty rates of any part of the British Empire. At the end of the war, virtually every family of the WPA had lost an uncle, husband, son, or brother. Newfoundland nurses returning from the war joined nurses at home in their battle to heal the wounded. Ethel Dickinson, exhausted after 3 years on the front, threw herself into further work during the Great Spanish Flu epidemic. In October 1918, Her years of dedication came to an abrupt end when she contracted the flu virus. She was dead and buried in less than 24 hours and was greatly missed by her sister suffragists at the ladies' reading room. Women's massive war effort gave them position and power. Public opinion and history seemed to be ready and on side. Nurse Mary Southcott rode in the Victory Parade as Joan of Arc, the patron saint of suffragists. By 1918, suffrage had been won in Great Britain and appeared imminent in the United States. Even the Daily News and the Telegram seemed to be on side. So the Newfoundland suffragists felt the time had come to launch their campaign for full woman suffrage. Informal meetings at Anna Mitchell's home on 1 Devon Row soon grew into the Women's Franchise League. A major publicity blitz of St. John's and surrounding areas was planned for the summer of 1920. The goal of the blitz was to collect signatures on the suffrage petition all across Newfoundland, a daunting task made possible through their wartime connections. Women canvassed door to door at private homes, shops, and factories. Suffragists sent a stream of letters to all the newspapers and to leading ladies in the outports, motivating delegations like this one in Carbonear to work towards the united cause of woman suffrage. The suffrage petition itself was framed in the patriotic language of the war.
A woman's mission extends outside her four walls. Wherever she sees wrong, her instincts bid her put them right. And the young, the aged, the deformed all come under her motherly care.
Ah, Fanny, go home and learn to bake your bread.
I bake excellent bread, thank you. And if you are a good fellow and sign the petition, I will give you a slice of my bread with molasses.
These were turbulent times in Newfoundland politics. The cod fishery was in a slump. The suffragists found themselves facing a new liberal reform government led by Sir Richard Squires, which was far from liberal on woman suffrage. The Squires government itself was divided by factions, the most powerful of which were the members belonging to the Fishermen's Protective Union, led by Sir William Coker. It was into this political minefield that the women of the Franchise League stepped.
The Honourable Member for St. John's East, Mr. Fox.
Mr. Speaker, I regret very much the attitude of government regarding women's suffrage. When a bill was presented a few weeks ago, the Liberal government denounced it. I would like to point out the absence today of two honourable gentlemen from the government side of the House who presented that suffrage bill a few weeks ago. Are they absent today? Because they did not want to be here to be told how to vote.
Honourable Prime Minister.
Mr. Speaker, it's unfortunate that these women have chosen a man to present the bill who sees fit to be offensive and insulting to his betters. Of course, members Small and Legros may not have had the opportunity to study abroad like the member for St. John's East. But while they were risking their lives in the Great War, Mr. Fox was enjoying the repose of the leisurely armchair and the luxury of the classics.
This petition has received the support of women from Twillingate, Bonavista, Trinity, and St. John's, to name but a few places. I am proposing that we amend the Elections Act by inserting between the words male and British subject the words or female. Is that too much to ask?
Mr. Speaker, nevertheless, I propose to defer the bill for 6 months.
This was the 6-month hoist. The bill was defeated by a straight party vote. With this defeat, the battle lines were drawn.
After all our work, I cannot believe they could vote down our bill. Every country in the Empire has suffrage, except Newfoundland and South Africa. Even Canada enjoys full suffrage.
Except Quebec, of course. Quebec and Newfoundland will always be last.
Sir Richard is trying his level best to dismiss us as so-called society ladies.
Which is why it is so important that we demonstrate all the support we have from the outports. Then he cannot pretend it's just us.
How many signatures do we have?
Over 5,000.
We need 20,000.
20,000?
Yes, with the outport ladies at the top of the list.
I think we can do it. We accomplished a lot with the publicity campaign and the petition drive. Public sympathy is on our side. Even the papers are positive.
Unfortunately, the Prime Minister is not.
Then we must continue to lobby the government. Thank you, Cecilia. I'm composing a letter for Sir Richard. And I'm also inviting lady squires to join our cause.
Lady squires? My dear Mrs. McNeil, she does not even acknowledge our existence.
She's no suffragist, but without her, Sir Richard would still be cutting cod's heads on the wharf in Harbour Grace.
I will invite her anyway. We mustn't overlook any possibilities. Now, it seems Mr. Jennings and Mr. Guppy have backed away from us. Does that mean Mr. Coker and the whole Fishermen's Protective Union are now against us?
No, I would not assume that. I think Mr. Coker seems to be in favor.
Well, they all seem to be.
Well, I know Sir Richard seems to be whatever he needs to be, but Mrs. Crosby is convinced that Mr. Coker is genuine.
We have got to get Mr. Coker to move. He's the only man in cabinet with enough influence of his own to support us. Mr. Coker, I really appreciate your taking the time to meet with us today.
Well, you ladies aren't easily put off. And the number of petitions is impressive. Well, you've done your work. And I do support you, Mrs. McNeil, as does the Fishermen's Union.
But what about your taking the lead, Mr. Coker?
Yes.
Oh, too busy, my dear. The price of fish is falling. My members are suffering. I can't make votes for women my priority. However, Mr. Jennings...
Mr. Jennings?
Mr. Jennings, having listened to the ladies of Twillingate and myself, may in fact be prepared to present the bill himself as a private member.
Mr. Jennings!
Ah, Mrs. McNeil. Mrs.
Eyre.
I thought I might see you in here today.
Good day, Mr. Jennings. Mr. Coker tells me you have consulted your district and may now be willing to support our cause and even present the suffrage bill in the House.
Well, you certainly stirred up those women in Twillingate. Yes, I'll support you.
But can you get Mr. Coker to move Sir Richard to support it?
Well, I can't say for that. It's a private member's bill. You'll have to get those fellows close to squires on your side. It won't be easy.
I happen to know, sir, that your mother supports the suffrage bill. I have her name on this petition right here. I'm thinking of inviting her to stay with me in town so that she might have the opportunity of telling you and your colleagues herself.
Your secretary is a woman, and must I remind you that many of your district workers are also women. You should wish they had the vote. They deserve it.
And, sir, if your poor sister is deserted by her husband, she will be left a virtual pauper under the present laws and entirely dependent on you for support.
On me, Mrs. Eyre?
I think we're doing quite well. We will soon have enough support to pass this, even as a private member's bill. Where's Agnes?
I'm here.
Ah, my lieutenant.
Yes, Mrs. McNeil, Mrs. Gosling, Mrs. Eyre. I was wondering when you would get around to my door. In fact, we were talking about you at a meeting of the cabinet last night, and the subject of your women's franchise bill came up.
Did Mr. Jennings raise it?
Oh, yes, he did. And we talked about it for some time. In the end, the Prime Minister said that he might as well make it a government bill.
A government bill? Sir Richard said that?
Yes, ladies, I am now prepared to table a bill for the enfranchisement of women as a government measure. It's virtually assured automatic passage.
We are aware of that, Sir Richard.
And delighted that you are supporting the bill personally. Frankly, we are surprised at the sudden turn of events.
Well, you know, I've always been in favor of suffrage in principle, but politics, you know, Mrs. McNeil, is a game of timing, and I believe the time is right.
We have no disagreement on that point.
And naturally, you will cease your canvassing now that the bill is being presented.
If we agree to these concessions, can you assure us of passage in this current session of the House?
Even if the House closes early for the summer break?
Oh, it'll pass this session early or late, 1 month, 3 at most, whatever I say goes. So, ladies, what do you say?
April 19th, 1921. Dear Sir Richard, the Women's Franchise League would be grateful if you would kindly give a definite reply to the request to table the Women's Franchise Bill at an early date. At the
Dear Mrs.
1920
McNeil,
session,
the pressure of business has been very great during the past few days, and there has been no opportunity whatever of discussing this matter with Committee of Council. Very truly yours, Prime
Dear
Minister
Sir,
Squires.
in the House this last session, we noticed that in answer to Mr. Bennett's question regarding the Woman's Suffrage Bill, you stated it as being a non-party measure. This surprised us, as you must have forgotten that you definitely promised to ensure the successful passage of our
Dear
bill this
Mrs.
session.
McNeil, the additional petitions you forwarded me in relation to women's suffrage were presented yesterday afternoon in the House of Assembly. I am unfortunately too busy this week to meet with your delegation. Very truly yours, the Prime Minister.
Mrs. Gosling, what a surprise to see you so early in the morning.
Whatever are you doing baking bread? Don't you realize this is our big day in the House of Assembly?
Cecilia's father is sick, so I had to let her go home to Catalina. So now I'm running the kitchen too until she gets back. I have to say, Mrs. Gosling, I feel pretty discouraged. I know we have been deceived, but I feel I have been so naive. I should have known what Sir Richard was up to. We never should have believed him. We had so much support from the private members.
Fanny, we could not have said no to Sir Richard either presenting the bill or not presenting the bill. That is the Prime Minister's option. Fanny, what happened to us happened to the Pankhursts. Prime Minister Asquith deceived the women of Great Britain into believing he was their ally. And I believe Sir Richard has read those same reports because he has followed Asquith's line of deception to a T.
Is it time to chain ourselves to the fences yet?
I see you've heard from Miss Jane Burke. I was wondering if those petitions from Fortune Bay would be here in time for the debate. But where are the signed petitions?
Please, have a seat, Armine, and read Jane Burke's letter.
Dear Sister Suffragists, my news is sad news, but first some good news.
I've spent the past several weeks collecting hundreds of signatures from the entire Fortune Bay area. Women and some supportive men have been anxious to see their names put to the Women's Franchise Bill. But now for the sad news. Yesterday, when I expected to receive a package of all the signatures, I was in distress since the package did not arrive. I know how much you've been counting on these petitions to present before the suffrage debate. Last evening, Papa, upon seeing me search for the post, inquired as to what I was searching. When I told him a package containing petitions, he said, "My dear, do not trouble yourself any further, for I have put them to good use as kindling for the fire." You can imagine my distress. I was so very angry with Papa that I could not bid him good night.
How will we ever succeed? Sorrowfully yours, Miss Jane Burke.
Poor Jane Burke.
Poor Fortune Bay. Poor Newfoundland.
And I thought we only had Sir Richard's opposition to deal with.
Well, Mrs. McNeil, it looks as though we're going to have to battle almost every man in our country before the vote is ours. Come on. Mrs. McNeil, I can see your husband beckoning to you.
Good day, ladies.
Good day, Mr. McNeil.
Go ahead, ladies. I'll catch up in a moment. If I didn't know better, I'd think Mr. Campbell was being outright rude.
Not so loud, Fanny. We have to talk.
Not now, Hector. I don't want to be late. The House is in session.
I've just been informed my job is on the line if you continue to campaign to get this bill passed.
What are you saying, Hector?
Are we ready to give up our security for the vote?
This bill is our security. I have to go in.
Fanny?
Mr. Prime Minister?
Mr. Speaker, this is the Women's Franchise Bill. As the bill meets with approval, and as women's franchise is a recognized principle of political science, I have much pleasure in moving that it be read a second time.
Mr. Crosby?
I take it that this bill, then, is a government measure?
No, sir, it is not. I did not anticipate that party lines would be drawn.
The Prime Minister promised that he would bring this bill in as a government measure, where members would be called upon to vote. And yet here we are again today, with the members of the executive keeping their mouths shut about one of the most important issues to go before this House in a long time. I ask the question again, Mr. Prime Minister, are you going to vote for this bill?
I did not say I would vote for this bill at this session.
Mr. Fox?
I do not think it fair to have the ladies like Mrs. Crosby and Mrs. Gosling and Mrs. Baird to come here year after year with petitions from all over the country of Newfoundland and have them thrown aside for another 6 months.
Mr. Speaker, I have not been opposed to women's suffrage. I pledged myself that I would introduce this bill, and I will do so. Next year, not this year.
The leaders of the government think that the people of
I can truly see why the suffragists in the mother country lost all decorum and became outspoken radicals.
Oh, this is very true, Mrs. McNeil. It's time for me to lead a march of the factory girls on the House of Assembly. And it's high time your franchise executive authorized me to lobby Mr. Coker and the Fishermen's Union.
Mrs. Earle, with all due respect, please do not speak to any government officials on our behalf. Your work with the Newfoundland Industrial Workers Association is highly controversial with our conservative allies. Our work is difficult enough. Please do not interfere with our lobbying.
Mrs. Browning, I will not stop at any level of society to further the cause of factory girls. Whether that means fighting for this suffrage bill or standing up for domestics and the unemployed. All are disenfranchised by their work and social situation.
Adeline, we have been friends for many years, but I must disagree with you on this. What I am about to tell you, I have never shared with anyone in St. John's. My own mother was an underpaid seamstress in Quebec, and I can't forget that, ever. Please let Mrs. Earle help us and these factory girls. We need all the help we can get.
Armina, I never would have guessed. Well, one confidence deserves another. My mother was a sailor's daughter. Promise me you will never tell a soul. Well, my dear, we certainly married well.
Ladies, it is agreed. Mrs. Earle should lobby for the suffrage bill. After all, we are working for the betterment of all women, young and old, rich and poor, our mothers and our daughters.
Of course you are. Whose hands did that fine work? Who sewed your dress and crocheted your gloves? Who's working right now baking bread in your husband's factory?
My bread. My bread.
Fanny?
Hector, I failed. Failed because. And yes, there's no supper. And yes, there's no bread. And now you're going to tell me that you have no job.
Fanny, you're doing too much.
What did you say to Mr. Campbell?
I told him, you can jolly well go to the devil.
Hector.
In the summer of 1921, the Franchise League received a much-needed boost. With the help of Mayor Gosling, Armin's husband, they won the municipal vote. But, through no fault of the mayor's, there were many loopholes, the main one being that women had to own or rent property to be eligible to vote. Some women purchased old barns and sheds. One woman went so far as to buy an outhouse so that she could vote. During this period, the International Suffrage Alliance intensified their support of the Newfoundland suffrage cause. Besides sending pamphlets, financial aid, and their union's newspaper, Jus Suffragis, Carrie Chapman Catt's assistant, Kate Truson, gave a series of rousing speeches to packed halls at the Methodist College in St. John's. In 1923, the International Suffrage Alliance held a convention in Rome. The Squires government rejected a written invitation to send a delegate. But May Kennedy, at her own expense, boarded the steamer in St. John's for Italy. 3 months after Mussolini's fascist regime had taken over Rome, May Kennedy rose in front of hundreds of delegates to give a speech on the unenfranchised women of the world. As one of the last British dominions to gain suffrage, the Newfoundland plight became a powerful cause. Meanwhile, back home, despite the scandals, the Squires government was returned to office. The Franchise League had now reached its major goal of 20,000 signatures. Women of all classes, from the suffragists in St. John's to fishermen's wives and Julia Salter Earle's factory girls, had put their names to petitions. An amazing feat of organization that demanded a response.
Going to see Sir Richard on a summer's afternoon. We suffragettes, nobody's pets, we work from dawn to noon. This gang of us together, we're bound to win out soon. Going to face Sir Richard on a summer's afternoon.
Sir Richard? Well then, I will address you as you wish. I am here on behalf of the Women's Franchise League to ask why you have deceived us into believing you would pass the women's suffrage bill in this sitting of the House. You cannot continue to ignore the wishes of the women of this country.
My dear madam, you're a naive idealist, prating about purity in politics. I'm a realist. I get things done.
Thank you, Sir Richard. That is the one honest thing you have ever said to us. I now understand why you fear women voting. Our vote will be a vote for integrity in political life, and that will mean the end of your political career.
My dear Mrs. McNeil, what is it they say? Wine, weeds, and women are the three great factors in the world of men. Now, if you don't mind, please leave. I have work to do and I have a headache.
You have a headache? Well, I have the cure for a headache.
What you need is some fresh air for all the important decisions you are about to make.
Sir, the only paper you need concern yourself with is this petition, containing the signatures of thousands of women from Burgeo to St. John's demanding the right to vote.
At long last, the Squires government fell. The new government, under Walter S. Monroe, filled with suffrage supporters like Crosby and Cashin, quickly passed the Women's Franchise Bill in April 1925. The Newfoundland Suffragists were immediately the toast of the 1925 Paris Convention and were eagerly celebrated around the world. The Evening Telegram duly reported that the Monroe government gave women suffrage, but no one gave suffrage to the women of Newfoundland and Labrador. It was a victory, which the women celebrated at Smithville Hall in St. John's on April 19, 1925. Fannie McNeil and May Kennedy ran in the December 1925 municipal election. Both Fannie and May received modest public support. Julia Salter Earle also ran and lost by a mere 11 votes, despite the fact that a ballot box from her strongest area was mysteriously lost. While an investigation was ordered, it was never carried out. Armine Gosling moved to Bermuda to be with her ailing husband. Fannie McNeil did not live long to enjoy the fruits of the suffrage victory. She died only 3 years later in 1928. That same year, Sir Richard was returned to office. His wife, Lady Helena Squires, became the first woman elected to the Newfoundland legislature. Women of Labrador, however, were not invited to exercise their franchise until they were asked if they wanted to join Canada in 1949.
Let us remember that we have also accomplished this for our children's freedom and love of this land. Though we differ in many things, in religion, in race, in politics, we shall be a unit in our demand for a woman's share in all privileges, opportunities, and responsibilities this country has to offer.
As we go marching, marching, we struggle to for men, for they are women's children, and we walk with them again. Our lives shall not be sweated, from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses. As we go marching, marching, unnumbered women dead, go crying through our singing, their ancient call for bread. Small art and love and beauty, their drudging spirits knew. Yes, it's bread we fight for, but we fight for roses too. As we go marching, marching, we bring the greater days. The rising of the women means the rising of the race. No more the drudge and idler tend that toil where one reposes, but a sharing of life's glories, bread and roses, bread and roses. Our lives shall not be sweated, from birth until life closes. Hearts starve as well as bodies. Give us bread, but give us roses.